So my name is Meg Townsend, and before I give my introduction, I wanted to introduce my co-presenter today, Sophia Ressler.
Hi everybody, I'm Sophia. I'm a staff attorney at the center, and I'm also our Washington wildlife advocate here in Washington State. Before we get this all started, I want to go over a few notes regarding the tech for this webinar. It looks like a few of you have already figured out the chat box. That's a place where you can say hi and comment and chat with each other as we go along. If you could only use the chat box for things related to this call, that would be great. There's a separate location for questions. So please direct any questions for Meg and I here in that question and answer box. And if you put them in the chat box, they're just much more likely to get lost. So the likelihood of me answering is much easier if you use that question and answer feature. If you called in not using the Zoom app, you're not going to see these features, but you can always reach out to us after the call with any questions, and we'd be more than happy to help answer them and engage you in further conversation on this topic. So I think that is about it on tech. So I'm going to pass it back over to Meg, and she will get us started.
Great, thanks so much, Sophia. So I want to welcome everyone again, and thank you so much for taking the time to join this call this evening. I know we have lots of events happening this evening in the news, so I'm really grateful that you all are joining us to talk about these important issues for the Pacific Northwest. My name is Meg Townsend, and I'm a staff attorney in the Center's Endangered Species Program working in the Portland office, and I'm really glad to be here with you all this evening. So tonight we'll be sharing the story of salmon and orcas in the Pacific Northwest and addressing ways to restore the Columbia-Snake River Basin to support sustainable recovery of these iconic species. We'll also be discussing an upcoming opportunity to engage around the release of a draft environmental impact statement by the government. And I'll cover that in more detail later. Our focus tonight is the Columbia River Basin, specifically the 4 lower Snake River dams. And in our presentation tonight, we will talk about salmon in the Columbia Basin, including the current threats and the status of the species. We'll also hear from Sophia discussing the relationship of salmon and southern resident killer whales, or orcas. And she'll talk about some of the issues that orcas are facing right now, including the primary threat to orcas, which is starvation due to lack of available prey. Then I'm going to discuss the legal recovery efforts for these species that have occurred to date, sort of going over a brief history, talking about a recent court order that's informing the NEPA process that we're all about to embark on, and then talk a little bit about what the outlook is like for success with this process. And finally, we'll be addressing how restoring the Snake River can support recovery of these iconic species, including possibilities like dam removal, river restoration, talking about how the community can provide the necessary support for this, and how we need to lean on our political leaders to take bold action to save the species now. As a last item, we'll tell you a little bit about how you can get involved. So if these issues are interesting to you and you'd like to stay informed, we'll have a little bit more information about that as well. And as Sophia said, at the end of the call, we'll have some time for questions. This call should take just about an hour, so let's get started. The Columbia and Snake River Basin includes those rivers which were once the greatest salmon rivers in the world. Now more than 55% of the spawning and rearing habitat that was once available to salmon and steelhead in the Columbia Basin is permanently blocked by dams. And in this map, you'll see little red dots, and those red and yellow dots, and those dots are the dams. The dams prevent salmon from returning to their birthplace to spawn, reproduce, and thrive. And they also kill young salmon as they migrate downstream on their journey to the ocean. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers operates a series of 8 dams on the lower Columbia River, which is right here, all the way to the Pacific Ocean. And they affect the habitat and migration of the anadromous salmon and steelhead species that live in this region. And these dams are Bonneville Dam, the Dalles, John Day, and McNary on the lower Columbia, and then the 4 lower Snake River dams, Ice Harbor, Lower Monumental, Little Goose, and Lower Granite, which is what we're going to be focusing on tonight. This area right here, which are the 4 lower Snake River dams. These dams were authorized in 1945 by the Rivers and Harbors Act. And in the next few slides, you'll see images of these dams and some information about the years that they were built. You'll also see that all 4 dams do have fish ladders, but these structures have pretty limited success, and I'll address that in more detail later. The first dam, as you're headed upstream from the Pacific Ocean, is Ice Harbor Dam. It's the first dam on the lower Snake River project. The second dam that salmon encounter as they migrate back upstream is the Lower Monumental Dam, seen here. You can see the fish ladder over here on the sort of the right-hand side of the screen. You have the turbines and then the powerhouse. This is Little Goose Dam, the 3rd dam of the Lower Snake River project. And the final dam is the Lower Granite Dam, which is the final dam of the Lower Snake River project. And Lake Lower Granite, which is created, the reservoir created behind this dam, extends upstream 40 miles from the dam's location all the way to Lewiston, Idaho, where the Army Corps had to construct about 8 miles of levees to protect the lives and property from any high water conditions, because the town of Lewiston actually sits below lake level. And these levees have become very expensive for Lewiston to maintain in conjunction with the Corps. So the main point of why I'm sort of giving you this background is that these dams, as you can see, many of them began construction in the 60s. Turbines became operational in the 70s. They're very old and very costly to maintain for not just you know, the ratepayers, but for taxpayers as well. Now I'm going to talk to you a little bit about one of my favorite species, wild Columbia-Snake River salmon. And these iconic species are central to the culture and, you know, economics and basically the lifeblood of the Pacific Northwest, as many of you know, probably why you're here tonight, for salmon and for orcas as well. Now, when Lewis and Clark first visited the Pacific Northwest about 200 years ago, there were at least 10, but upwards of 16 million wild salmon and steelhead that entered the Columbia River Basin annually. At that time, about 4 million also packed the Columbia's largest tributary, the Snake River. And that was long before the dams were built, of course. Now there are fewer than 60,000 wild fish that return to the Snake River each year, which is about, you know, less than 2%. By 1986, the Snake River's native coho salmon were completely extinct. And today, all surviving Snake River salmon populations are listed under the Endangered Species Act. There have been 5 federal endangered species required salmon plans that have come and gone, and each have been declared illegal in federal court. The government has spent billions of dollars of wasted ratepayer and taxpayer dollars to try to restore or delist the Columbia snake population of salmon, and those efforts have largely been unsuccessful, as we'll discuss in more detail. And for those of you on the call that aren't as familiar with the biology of salmon, I'm going to do a brief overview of the salmon life cycle and why they're so unique. Salmon are born in freshwater streams, and they migrate out to the ocean when they become adults and spend their adult life in the ocean, only to migrate back to freshwater to spawn. They're born in streams and emerge from their nests or redds as elvin, as you can see from this life cycle wheel here up on your screen. They spend their juvenile years rearing in freshwater streams and eating enough food to mature into smolthood. Once a juvenile salmon becomes a smolt, it begins its outmigration from the stream where it was born to the ocean. And this process is known as smoltification, and it involves some physiological changes that allow the salmon to adapt from the freshwater to the saltwater and back again. Once salmon reach the ocean, they spend their adult lives foraging for food and growing in size and strength and saving up enough energy for their return trip back to the freshwater to spawn. Once they receive their innate biological cue that it's time to spawn, adult salmon will then travel all the way back to their native stream to spawn. No one knows exactly how they accomplish this, although there are many scientific theories about this process. I'm not going to get into that tonight. So as I said, spawning salmon must have enough energy stored to return to their native stream. Spawning will occur when female salmon beat the gravel, the substrate of the stream, to dig her redd and deposit her eggs. And a group of male salmon will come and jockey for position to be the lucky one to inseminate her eggs. And this is, their last ditch effort to try to get their genes into the environment. Once a salmon is done spawning, it dies, which really is the ultimate sacrifice. When baby salmon emerge from their redds and feed on insects, those insects consume decaying salmon carcasses. So the life cycle is complete and begins again. And one thing that is really special about salmon as well is they bring back all the rich nutrients from the ocean that they've gathered throughout their adult lives back to the high mountain streams. And when they die, their carcasses become fertilizer for our big Pacific Northwest trees and riparian plants. So they really create the environment that helps other species like steelhead and Pacific lamprey and other fish and even mammals to survive and thrive. And sadly, as I mentioned, salmon are in steep decline right now. There are, as people say, 4 H's of salmon decline. And I'll tell you a little bit about them to give you some background about sort of the major threats to salmon. Those are the loss of habitat, the presence of hydropower or dams on river systems, the operation of certain types of hatcheries, and harvest of salmon. And these issues are really complex and they're all kind of interconnected. And one of the things that we really need to understand is how to address each one in order to help recover our salmon species in the Pacific Northwest. With habitat loss, salmon require intact watersheds with clean, stable spawning gravels, off-channel pools and beaver ponds where the juvenile salmon can overwinter, healthy estuaries and nearshore habitat where they can, thrive in coastal environments, and productive coastal oceans for the feeding migration of salmon. Their habitat spans for thousands of miles from high elevation rivers of the Western Rockies all the way to the North Pacific. And this forges a vital connection between the marine and terrestrial world and supports the healthy ecosystems in which in turn sustain them and, of course, the rest of the ecosystem here. Threats to habitat like logging, mining, and overgrazing have destabilized stream banks, caused increased sedimentation, and deprived rivers of the vital large woody debris like big logs that salmon need for shelter as they migrate. Land clearing and urbanization has also increased the flashiness of river hydrographs with more intense destructive flooding events and even more severe summer droughts. The draining of wetlands and beaver ponds, channelization and diking have also taken a heavy toll on salmon habitat and reduced the diversity of habitats available for juvenile salmon. The second H, hydropower. We talked a little bit about how many dams are in the Columbia Basin and how they cut off about 55% of the salmon spawning and rearing habitat in the Columbia system alone. In Washington, Oregon, and Idaho, and California, there are hundreds of dams that prevent salmon from returning to their native spawning grounds. And with the exception of the 45 miles of free-flowing river in the Hanford reach of the Columbia and Snake just below Lewiston, much of the rest of the watershed has been reduced to a series of slack water impoundments by a number of main stem dams on the Columbia and Snake. The 55% of spawning and rearing habitat that's blocked by dams prevents, the juvenile or the adult salmon from coming back to their native spawning grounds, but dams also prevent juvenile salmon from migrating to the ocean and cause mortality as they get turned up in the turbines. I'll cover that a little bit more later. Another big issue with dams is that they create reservoirs, which are basically big, slow water impoundments that alter river temperatures and increase the potential for predation. The reduced water velocity in reservoirs increases the time it takes for juveniles to migrate downstream. It's not at all like a natural river condition where they're used to just sort of getting taken by the current and out to the ocean. They have to sort of navigate their way through a major impediment before they even get to the dam. It also creates higher water temperatures that can have an adverse effect on juveniles and adults as they have more threats facing them as well, with more predators in the slower moving water. And as I mentioned, although there are fish passage facilities like fish ladders at these dams, the changes that these dams bring cannot really be fixed simply by passing fish above them, because dams fundamentally alter the movement of water, sediment, and fish through rivers, and slow and warm the water, prevent upstream and downstream movement of fish, and starve the river of downstream gravel and wood. And I also mentioned the third H hatcheries. Since about the mid-20th century, hatcheries have been widely used to supplement the sport and commercial fisheries of the region. They've also been used to mitigate for habitat loss due to dams and to replace populations of wild salmon that have been declining from overharvest and habitat degradation. Increasingly, however, science has told us that most hatcheries cannot adequately replace wild salmon, and that large-scale hatchery production is incompatible with healthy wild populations of salmon. Truly, in order for salmon to recover, we need to dramatically reduce the number of hatchery fish that spawn in the wild, and we need to eliminate some hatchery programs altogether where watersheds can support robust populations of wild fish. Finally, I'm going to mention the final H, which is harvest, which is a little bit easier for most folks to wrap their heads around. Overharvest dates back to the earliest days of commercial fishing in the Pacific Northwest. And salmon and steelhead populations have declined pretty much continuously since the first industrialized fishing began in the mid-19th century. Growing concern about ongoing problems of overharvest and bycatch, or the incidental catch of endangered wild salmon, is a problem throughout their range. So essentially, the 4 H's really could be boiled down to 1 H, which is humans. We have considerably altered and changed the entire environment that salmon are dependent upon to support their life cycle, and made it increasingly more difficult for them to be able to fulfill their biological time frame throughout their life. And ongoing efforts to save wild salmon in the Pacific Northwest have been largely unsuccessful. The government has spent more than $15 billion on salmon recovery efforts over the last 2 decades, including about $10 billion of public taxpayer money. And so far, they have failed to recover any of the wild salmon and steelhead populations in the Columbia Basin that are currently at risk of extinction. As I said before, we really need action in all 4 of those H's to save salmon. And what we're talking about tonight, dams, are something that we can address right now to save up to 50% of the Snake River Chinook salmon. And here's a list of the salmon in the Columbia Basin that are currently threatened with extinction, listed under the ESA as either threatened or endangered. And I've highlighted in salmon the Snake River Fall Chinook and Snake River Spring and Summer Chinook, because they are two of the stocks of salmon that are identified as priority prey for orcas, which Sophia is going to cover in a little bit. And they're in the top 10 list of priority stocks for orcas. So these are crucial for orcas to survive. And I also have highlighted in light pink the Upper Columbia River Spring Chinook salmon, because this population of fish is in the top 15 most important for orca survival. So 3 of the ESA listed salmonids in the Columbia-Snake Basin are essential for the survival and recovery of orcas. And unfortunately, as I mentioned before, current estimates of wild salmon populations typically average under or around 2% of historical numbers. Now, although the Columbia and Snake River dams have fish passage facilities that can route fish away from the turbines, there's significant mortality. This table that you're looking at right now basically shows that the federal Columbia-Snake River dams are responsible for killing high numbers of endangered juvenile salmon. Scientific studies show that each dam can kill up to 16% of fish migrating upstream to spawn, but downstream passage of smolts has proven to be the most problematic. Juvenile fish migrating to the ocean that are unable to locate the fish ladders are drawn through turbines, where most are killed. And in total, dams can kill as much as 92% of Snake River salmon headed to sea, and up to another 25% on their way back upstream to spawn.
Thanks so much, Meg. I am going to talk about our southern resident killer whales and connect the importance of the salmon that Meg was just talking about to those whales. So southern resident killer whales, or southern resident orcas, are one of 10 known ecotypes of killer whales in our region. This is important to recognize because research on other ecotypes, such as transient populations, can help to inform the management decisions that we make for the southern residents. The southern residents were listed under the Endangered Species Act in 2005. But despite these important protections provided by the Endangered Species Act, this critically endangered population has dropped to 73, which is its lowest level in more than 30 years. In January, another whale was reported missing, which likely brings the number down to just 72 whales. Without action from the federal government, we could witness the extinction of the southern residents in our lifetime. Salmon are a critical food source for these endangered West Coast orcas. And these orcas are dying out before our eyes, as I mentioned before. And this is primarily as a result of starvation due to lack of available suitable prey. Other threats to the whales include vessel noise pollution and contamination from toxic pollutants. But there's a scientific consensus that a lack of prey is the primary threat. However, we do need to address all of these threats in order to save the southern resident killer whales. The whales feed almost exclusively on salmon. Not only Chinook, but Chinook are their preferred species, as it is the most rewarding in terms of calories per effort. They will feed on Chinook even when other salmon species are present in higher abundance. Snake Fall and Snake River stocks are in the top 10 stocks for southern resident killer whale prey, as Meg already mentioned. And in fact, this is the time of year that the southern residents tend to hang out at the mouth of the Columbia for fishing for salmon. They spend much of the winter and spring, early spring, up and down the coast and near the mouth of the Columbia, trying to take advantage of some of the largest salmon runs in the lower 48 states. So These are some striking images that have been captured recently because scientists have begun to use drones to track changes in orca health. So on the left in this image, we see a healthy orca in 2015 from above. In the middle, there's an image of that same orca in 2018, clearly considerably thinner. And on the right side is the same orca last May, who has appeared to decline even further. One of the terms that scientists have coined that's an indicator of malnourishment in southern in orcas in general is peanut head. And this May 2019 photo that's up shows the whale's head indent inward, and that's due to a lack of prey. These aerial images have been incredibly important in providing the visual evidence of starvation in this population. By now, most people are familiar with the heartbreaking images of a mother orca pushing her stillborn calf for over 1,000 miles in over 17 days. In 2018, these images were widely shared in the media and provided a compelling case that urgent actions are needed to stop the spiral towards extinction. The loss of the newborn is tragic, and sadly, it's not out of the norm. None of the calves born to moms in the southern resident killer whale group, which consists of the J, K, and L pods, survived between 2015 and 2018. However, there is hope. In 2019, 2 new calves were born to the southern residents, and they both still appear to be healthy. But even with that good news, southern resident orcas need more salmon now. Ecosystem recovery is necessary to ensure the long-term survival of the southern residents, but their decline and critical status requires ecosystem-based management paired with short-term immediate impact actions that provide more suitable prey. Reducing ocean salmon fisheries should be considered as a temporary mitigation measure to allow time for longer-term management actions to take effect so that salmon productivity can be improved. Other short-term considerations include reduction in vessel noise, which disrupts the southern residents' hunting and socializing, as well as reduction in toxic contaminants entering our waterways, which threaten things such as whales' reproduction and health. But the long-term recovery of this species is dependent on making their prey more abundant and readily available, and removal of the lower Snake River dams is a vital step in making that happen. In fact, leading orca scientists have said that orca recovery may be impossible if these dams are not removed.
So I just saw someone say on the chat, we need to breach the 4 lower Snake River dams, which is exactly what this presentation is about. So I'm really glad that some of you share that desire. Here's what we know right now. If we take out the 4 lower Snake River dams, it will restore about 140 miles of river, 14,000 plus acres of riparian and in-stream habitat for salmonids, which is shown here in the map in light blue. That's a big chunk of prime spawning and rearing habitat for salmon. Breaching these dams will cut the dam-caused salmon mortality by at least 50%. And it's going to restore productive access for wild salmon and steelhead to about 5,500 miles of contiguous, pristine, unprotected upriver habitat in Northwest Oregon, Central Idaho, and Southeast Washington. A lot of this spawning and rearing habitat above the lower Snake River is high elevation, and so it also provides a much needed cold water refuge as a critical buffer against a warming climate. Restoring the free-flowing lower Snake River will deliver tremendous economic, ecological, and cultural benefits to tribal and non-tribal people of the Pacific Northwest and the nation. So I'm going to quickly go through this because we want to get to, why we're here. But I want to let you know that there have been 5 consecutive salmon plans that have been ruled inadequate and illegal by the courts since the 90s. And just in spring 2016, this past decision invalidating the 5th a federal court in Portland, Oregon said that the National Marine Fisheries Service acted illegally by concluding that dam operations did not violate the Endangered Species Act, that it applied an improper standard and failed to properly consider impacts from climate change, and also relied on some uncertain actions that weren't possible. The court also held that the Army Corps and the Bureau of Reclamation violated the National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA, by failing to prepare a proper environmental impact statement and relying on outdated science. So soon after this decision, the court ordered the agencies to produce a new EIS to update the management of federal dams in the Columbia Basin, including the 4 lower Snake River dams, as required by NEPA, and was also required to produce a new salmon plan. The 3 agencies are currently at work to complete the court-ordered NEPA review, which is meant to detail all credible recovery alternatives for wild salmon endangered by the federal dams and reservoirs in the Columbia-Snake Basin. However, recent information demonstrates that this process is being badly manipulated, with predetermined outcomes, skewed analyses, and significantly limited opportunities for public input. Virtually, there's been no transparency with this process. And the problem with this is that another inadequate and illegal NEPA review and federal salmon plan will increase uncertainty, will heighten the risk and cost for the people and communities of the Northwest, and basically perpetuate the failing and expensive status quo. So the Trump administration has truncated the NEPA process, resulting in a rushed analysis that will most certainly ignore the science and discount or entirely disregard sustainable alternatives like breaching the 4 dams. We expect that the draft EIS will be coming out this Friday. We have some sources that indicate that that's when we can expect it to come out. And we know that this is not going to deliver the solutions that we need to fix declining fish populations and save starving orcas, or end, the ongoing litigation. Some other failures that we anticipate are, failure to address climate impacts on salmon, failure to address impacts on orcas much at all, maybe mentioning them, but not really making the connection between the dams and orcas, providing, this limited public participation and input, and making it ultimately more expensive for us all in the region. And we stand to lose these species forever. So, the good news is Bonneville Power has sort of an uncertain future right now, with a huge horizon for renewable energies in our region. Also, just last week, or the week before, Governor Brown of Oregon sent a letter to Washington's Governor Inslee, basically advocating for breaching the 4 lower Snake River dams, which is a really bold and courageous step for a political leader. And so, the center has sent a letter to her, thanking her for her position and for her bold action, and calling for even more protection for these species. Another final glimmer of hope right now is that there have been 2 calves that were born in 2019 to the southern residents. And we're hoping to see them this summer as they move with their pod through the Salish Sea. The key is, though, that breaching these dams will ultimately take an act of Congress. So right now, we need to show our leaders that there is strong regional support for restoring the lower Snake River, for sustainably recovering our wild salmon, for protecting our orcas, and providing necessary economic assistance to local communities, all while updating the infrastructure to support these necessary actions. The draft EIS, as I said, will be released this week, and that will initiate a public comment process that's going to last only 45 days. Recent intel suggests that it might be delayed, but I got word today saying that we think it's coming out Friday. So for everyone on the call, we need everyone's support for restoring the lower Snake River to support wild salmon and orcas in the Pacific Northwest. So We really would like everyone involved on this call to stay tuned for updates. Look in your emails. We're going to have an action alert coming out at the end of the week, hopefully when the DEIS comes out. And we'd love it if you all could commit to providing comments to the agencies that we can then show our political leaders that the region is tired of the status quo and that we stand up for these species and for taking out the 4 lower Snake River dams. So thank you all for joining. We'd love to open it up to questions. So please either type your question in the question box, or I think, Sophia, is there a raised hand feature as well?
Our participants don't have the ability to, they don't have the ability to talk, so all questions need to go in the Q&A box, and you can just type them. I also have a question that came in from Jim that I was asking for more clarification on. So if you would be willing to provide that, I would hope to get that answered. We have a good first question that I will start off with from my friend David. Hi, David. So David asked, if the lower Columbia dams are left in place, how will the salmon get past them to get to the lower Snake River? So I think David is referring to those 4 dams on the Columbia that you actually get to before the lower Snake River dams.
Good question, David. So as I mentioned, there are those 4 lower dams, and all of the dams, all of the 8 dams here on the Columbia do have fish ladders. The fish can get past them to get back to the lower Snake River. But as I said, there's about a 25% mortality from the dams at each dam, potentially, of fish trying to get back through. Another issue that some of the tribes have been calling out recently, and that many of you who have ever been either in a boat or visiting the dams have seen, is that there are predators that will wait at the bottom of Bonneville Dam for the migrating salmon to funnel their way into the fish ladder. And while the dams kill far more salmon than any of the predators, this is definitely sort of a shocking sight for folks that see that. So that's another issue that the dams cause. Having a large dam on a river system, if we back up a little bit and just take a look at any one of these dams on the lower Snake River, the dam spans the river, and the fish ladder is a very small structure, and for a fish to find it, it takes a while. Probably the fish can't just swim naturally. It has to sort of bang its head literally against the dam until it finds the fish ladder. So there's a lot of opportunity for predation, and there's a lot of opportunity for failure. And, often fish don't make it. So although they can, it's not a perfect system.
Thanks, Meg. I have another question about the potential for doing fish drops in the current feeding area, and how, if that's a potential solution to help the survival of the southern residents.
Fish drops, are you talking about releasing, if they're talking about releasing fish into the ocean, are you talking about them as in the orcas?
Yeah, I think that this person is talking about survival of the orcas.
So Sophia, maybe you can fill in some gaps here, but what I understand about the orcas diet is that they need very large, developed adult Chinook salmon in order to get the nutrients that they need, especially for pregnant females. One of the major issues with the southern residents is that calves have not been surviving past, their birth, or, a few months after birth. So it's up to, the diet of the pregnant females to support the life after birth, and just dropping a bunch of, small hatchery fish, or even just releasing a bunch of small fish, it's not going to be enough. The size of the fish that are needed to sustain orcas is considerable. And, it's essentially what wild fish grow to be when they get to, live out their life in a natural process. So Sophia, I don't know if you have anything to add, but.
No, I think that that covers it. I also think that just interfering, any further interference that we have with wild fish and potential for hatchery fish to, you know, take spawning ground, compete for food. We really think that the important factor here is restoring these wild fish populations. So that's kind of the emphasis that we think should be put on this, to restore those wild fish populations so that we don't have to rely on other types of fish. I will also say that in terms of other potential short-term solutions for helping out the southern resident killer whales, we think that there's some viable solutions in doing things like what Meg mentioned earlier, working to make sure that our fish harvest is not detrimentally affecting the whales, making sure that noise from vessels is not causing them more harm during their hunt for scarcer food than it needs to be. That and then also that the contaminants that we're putting into our waters are not, that we're lessening that effect on orcas as well. So we think that there are some really good short-term solutions that can be put in place while we try to restore these salmon habitats, and that is something that we're working on here at the center as well.
Yeah, and there was a great comment in the chat window. It looks like Veronica Felt says that relying on fish drops will also hinder the survival of southern residents, as it could impact their traditional hunting habits and cause an unhealthy dependency on humans feeding them. That's very true. So we have another question, I think.
Yeah, we have several people asking if we're gonna share the PowerPoint, and we need to talk with our tech team. Meg and I are not the people that are usually in charge of these PowerPoints, but
So actually what I understand is that if you're registered for this webinar, you will get a recording of it after the fact. You'll also get some follow-up communications that can connect you to me and to Sophia. So if there's any information that you would like clarified, I can share, anything with you, and you'll get a copy of, a recording of this presentation as well. So hopefully that will be good enough. And again, I'm always happy to answer questions, as is Sophia.
And I think that also leads us into, Veronica asked a question about, will there be an outreach guide with talking points and social media posts that was similar to the Call of the Wild campaign, which was our campaign on wolves. Do you know the answer to that, Meg?
Yeah, so we're going to be putting together comment letters, and shortly thereafter we will be sharing the center's talking points and resources for folks, because this is kind of an evolving process that we expect to sort of be unfolding all year. As the NEPA process concludes, there will be also an Endangered Species Act consultation following the NEPA process. So there's a lot of opportunity for public engagement. There's a lot of opportunity for outreach, and sort of we're exploring with the Mobilize for the Wild folks how we can best train volunteers that are really interested in helping getting even more active on this issue. So if you want more information, Veronica, definitely send us an email, and we can try to help you get connected that way. Looks like there's another question from Karen Davis that I wanted to address. She says, I thought that it did not require an act of Congress removing the dams. According to Jim Waddell, retired Army Corps of Engineers, the Army Corps has the power to put the dams on non-operational status if the dams are losing money or harming endangered species, and they are both, which is true. You're right that they are harming both, and I do believe that the Army Corps does have the power to put the dams on non-operational status. However, simply putting the dams on non-operational status, will leave the impediment in the river, and if the dam's not operating, I'm not really sure how much of a benefit to salmon that would be. The real benefit would be breaching the dam. And to do that, we need to support the infrastructure that will sort of replace the main authorization actions of the dam. So these dams are mostly authorized for hydropower generation and transportation, barges going up and down and all the way to Lewiston, which is our furthest inland port in the United States. So, you know, they would be, they would need to be sort of supported in the rail system. That's, you know, you can kind of see it even in this picture here. I believe that's the railway right there. That would sort of supplement or replace entirely the transportation capabilities of the dams. And we really need to have a robust funding package, sort of similar to what happened with Elwha, similar to what's happening with the Klamath dams. There needs to be funding, you know, available for these efforts.
I'm going to ask people to, again, if you have questions that you're hoping for Meg and I to answer, to put those in the question and answer box rather than the chat box. It's just easier for me to keep track of them that way. So I appreciate everybody doing that. I have another interesting question that I think has a lot to do with why we have people on this call, regarding what we're doing to gain support from elected officials for the breaching of these dams.
So one of the things that we really want to do with the comments that are generated in connection with the draft environmental impact statement that we're asking all of you to participate in is to create packages to send to our elected officials to tell them, you know, just how much regional support we have, how much unified support we have for restoring the lower Snake River. And restoring these populations of crucial species for our region. And I think right now, you know, if you want to get involved on your own, one of the things that you can do is write letters, call, have conversations with folks that you know about this issue. Just sort of elevate the awareness. I've heard from some of our partners in Washington state that Oregonians are largely absent from the conversation. Until recently, you know, with this action by Governor Brown, there hasn't really been a whole lot of vocal support for this issue. And now is kind of our opportunity to shine a little bit and to show the region and show the nation that this is something that we need to be paying attention to, and that we need to support, you know, a dam removal funding bill, and we need to get this issue sort of on the front of you know, what candidates are talking about, at least in the region, and hopefully eventually, you know, at a national level as well.
Another question regarding kind of short-term effects. Are there any opportunities for fish ladders to be improved?
You know, as I said, fish ladders are pretty limited. One of the short-term measures that's being taken right now is the flex spending agreement. So it's flex spill agreement that is allowing for more spill of water over the dams at times when salmon are out migrating. So at the peak, you know, times when the smolts are going out to the ocean, having more water released and not sent through the turbines reduces the chances that, you know, salmon will be entrained by the turbines. So that's something that's currently in place, and we anticipate that the draft environmental impact statement is simply going to sort of maintain that flex spill, which is something, you know, we support the flex spill as an interim measure, but, you know, long term, that's not going to save the species. It's not a cure-all for, you know, the level of mortality that exists as these juvenile salmon migrate out to the ocean. And ultimately, you know, as I mentioned, there's a lot of other issues that come with these dams, like, you know, the reservoirs creating the slack water that make it difficult for the juvenile salmon to navigate, you know, increased predation below dams, you know, just a myriad of other issues that need to be addressed by taking out the dams.
I'll also say there are some other, we have some partners that are working on some other interesting and innovative ways to help alleviate pressure on the system. Some different ways of fishing, some different ways of passage of these dams that are definitely short-term solutions. Wild Fish Conservancy has some studies going on the Columbia, but Wild Fish Conservancy will also tell you that, you know, these dams need to be removed in order to truly get this species back up to where we need them to be in order to save the orcas and you know, make sure that the salmon populations are strong again. I have a question about why, whether we know why Tahlequah might have pushed her deceased calf around like that. And I don't think that there is necessarily science or a scientific consensus on that, but there has been lots of talk about it very much being a sign of mourning and you know, a call for help sort of thing. The, you know, southern resident killer whales and orcas in general are incredibly intelligent creatures. They have really complex social structures. They do, you know, they have close relationships with their family members. So a lot of the ideas behind why that mom might have pushed her baby around for that long really has to do with kind of, you know, the same kind of reasons why humans would show that sort of emotion, that it was a mourning and you know, a concern for her family and their survival.
It was heart-wrenching. It was really hard to watch, but you know, I heard even some people saying that she was trying to, you know, get us to pay attention, or, you know, as a wake-up call. You know, she was mourning definitely, but some have speculated, you know, that she wanted us to see that she was doing this, and wanted us to pay attention because we're clearly the ones who are responsible.
We have a time for a few more questions. You guys are asking really good questions. I'm trying to pick out some of the ones that there might be overlap or you know, interesting, although they're all interesting. So I apologize if we don't get around to yours. Can you talk more, Meg, about whether the Northwest states have the ability, based on some sort of states' rights, to demand the removal of the dams on the Lower Snake?
I'm not really sure that's something that folks have really been exploring, but I do know that if we have unified regional support for taking out the dams, then we'll have a lot more traction, you know, regionally with our lawmakers. If we can, you know, sort of have a unified voice, saying that we advocate for breaching the dams, and then we can show, you know, DC that this is something that we all support and that we all stand for. You know, we can support that legislation and get the funding needed to take these dams out ultimately. So I'm not really sure about a state's rights leverage, you know, for this, but it's something to consider, and it's a good idea, and we definitely need, you know, bold and innovative ideas in order to save these species. So I appreciate your idea.
And we have a question about whether there's been an economic plan put together that would take into account the expenses for building alternatives to barge use and the cost of the removal of these dams.
You know, we haven't done that as, you know, an organization, but there is a lot of research out there about sort of, you know, what it would take financially, and a lot of energy groups, you know, renewable advocates, and you know, power ratepayers are also sort of looking into these issues. just to let you all know, I don't know if anybody's aware of the Public Interest Environmental Law Conference that takes place in Eugene. It takes place this March, the first weekend of March, but I'm going to be down there on Saturday. I have a panel talking about these issues if you want to come meet me in person and talk to me. And before the panel at I think 2:15 on Saturday, there will be a showing of the film Damned to Extinction. And that talks a lot about the economics of dam removal and sort of what is needed to support sustainable recovery of salmon and orcas in the Pacific Northwest. So, you know, we're more focused on the wildlife and, you know, and habitat advocacy, but there are a lot of groups that are primarily focused on the economics, and there's a lot of research out there. So let me know if you want me to point you in the right direction of more of that.
And I just want to be clear, because I think that I'm seeing some confusion still on what it is that we're asking you to do and the kind of outreach that is going to follow from this presentation. So just for clarity, you will be receiving an email if you signed up for this webinar. It will contain both contact information for Meg and I, so feel free to get in touch with us regarding any questions that we maybe didn't have time to answer tonight. As Meg said, we have a draft environmental impact statement coming out likely this Friday on this issue. We have, you know, really serious concerns that it's not going to include an option of breaching these dams, and so it's not going to look into that. So once that comes out, we will be in contact trying to get your comments and get your input on that in order to send to the federal government so that they are aware that there is serious people power behind this and interest in how to restore these salmon populations by removing those dams. Meg, did I cover everything?
Definitely, yeah. And I have a couple of follow-up points, you know, at the end. I see a couple questions I want to just touch on briefly. And there's so many questions, I don't think we'll be able to get to all of them, but I see a few. Mary asked if we're collecting the public comments and delivering them as the Wolf campaign. That's what we're planning to do. We're collecting public comments. We're going to deliver them to the agencies, and we're also going to package them and give them to our representatives. So that's something that we're doing. I see a question from Veronica saying, will we be participating in the March for the Dams event beginning this Sunday? And I believe that some of us will be, and I'd love to connect with you, Veronica, a little bit more about that. So let's chat offline. Lonnie asked about about Mike Simpson of Idaho's efforts to sort of advocate for taking out the dams. And he's a Republican. He's actually been recently very vocal about his position, sort of backing the removal of the 4 lower Snake River dams when he has been talking about salmon recovery. And he's sort of been vocal advocating for, you know, for necessary measures to protect salmon. And he's basically, you know, he sort of flirted with the idea. He hasn't really come out and said we need to take out the dams now, but essentially that has been his position, that has been his stance. And it's very encouraging to see that this issue is not just one on one side of the aisle. It's one that, you know, everyone in the region should get behind, no matter if you're a Republican or a Democrat. This affects people in, you know, rural parts of the states. It affects people in urban areas. I mean, this is our culture. This is everything that is so important for the Pacific Northwest. So without salmon, our whole identity, you know, including non-tribal and tribal people would be lost. So this is really important for folks on all sides of this issue to get involved in. I talked a little bit about the sea lion predation issue. That's not something that the center is planning to address. But as I said, you know, dams kill far more salmon than any of the predators. I think back on, I had a slide about it, I believe, and if not, I can give you some more information if you want to contact us about it. But science has conclusively shown that no matter how many salmon, the sea lions eat, or, cormorants eat, that's, killing those species in order to save salmon is just scapegoating one species to save another. And it's not really going to address the biggest issue, which is the dam. And someone asked about the sediment. There's been a lot of dam removals that have happened recently. And so we have really good models to show us where the sediment will go and how it will dissipate. And one other, great example I can sort of point to is when Mount St. Helens erupted. We had a lot of sediment deposited into all of our Northwest rivers, and very quickly that was washed out and cleared. So, once sediment is released from behind a dam, it doesn't take long for a river to restore itself to its natural flow. For a great example of this, go up to the Olympic Peninsula and check out the Elwha Dam or Elwha River. I actually have next to my desk, I have a little bolt that I collected from near the dam site. The dam is gone. The Elwha Dam and the Glynns Canyon Dam have both been taken out, and the river is completely wild again, and it's beautiful. I mean, it hasn't taken many years for the river to be restored to its natural flow. So the sediment will basically be washed out with the power of the river, especially during like a spring flood pulse. There may be some efforts that are needed downstream at other dams to try to dig that out, but that's something that can definitely be mitigated for in something like a legislative bill. Somebody asked, hold on, I don't see it anymore. I thought I saw a question about if we take out the 4 lower Snake River dams and leave the lower Columbia dams in place, what will be the benefit? And many scientific studies have been done on this issue, and the conclusion is that if we take out the 4 lower Snake River dams, it's going to increase the population of the Snake River salmon up to 50%, but possibly even more. A lot of the lower, the populations of salmon lower in the Columbia River are doing a lot better than the Snake River populations because they have fewer dams to have to get over. And once we take out the four lower Snake River dams, those same salmon will have fewer dams. So the benefit is pretty considerable to those 2 priority stocks for orcas. Let's see. What else can I do here?
Well, and I would say, I know that we are kind of at our 1 hour mark. So if people have further questions, you'll definitely be getting Meg and my contact information. So if you don't feel like your question was answered tonight or you want more information, I would say feel free to reach out to us. I don't know, Meg, if you want to take maybe one more question before we call it a night.
Sure, yeah. Let's see here. Let me open up the, oops.
Or I'm happy to throw one at you as well.
Yeah, if you could, that'd be great. I can't quite see it right now.
I think this is a really great question. What is going to replace the energy that is generated by those dams?
So I don't know the exact calculation, but I do know that there have been estimates that say that only a handful of wind turbines may be necessary to replace the power. There's not a whole lot of power that's generated from these dams, and BPA is kind of operating on a surplus right now. So if you support dam removal with tandem efforts for properly sited wind energy and properly sited solar, so it's not impacting other species or habitat, then there's a huge potential for not only replacing the energy that is generated by these dams, but surpassing it even. In the Columbia Basin, the whole gorge essentially is almost like a wind tunnel. I mean, we have so much wind that builds up in the region up there. And so having a couple turbines per dam would basically provide the same energy benefit in the long term.
So thank you all so much for joining us tonight. We hope you found this interesting. We're so glad that you chose to spend an hour with us this evening. And I think that our closing message is just to kind of look for follow-up. And
yeah, I do have a couple closing thoughts, Sophia, if that's okay.
Yeah.
Just to say again that ultimately this issue is not just about salmon and orcas, but about the rivers themselves. It's about economics, and it's about the communities in our region that are impacted by the failed management of these dams. And if we want to transform the entire region to a more sustainable model, we really need to remove these dams and support the surrounding communities when they come out. All of you can make a difference now by engaging in our public comment process and staying informed as this develops throughout the year. We really want to show our political leaders that the region is done with the outdated model and supports healthy rivers that sustain wild salmon, orcas, and peoples of the Pacific Northwest. So please keep checking our website and your email for updates and developments from us. We'll send you an update just as soon as we have the DEIS in our hands. And if you're participating in this webinar, we'll be able to follow up with you as soon as it's released. So thank you again for your time. We really appreciate all of your interest and engagement on this issue. It's really important to me. It's really important to Sophia. It should be important to everybody in the region. And hopefully we'll be in touch going forward. So thank you all.
Thanks, everybody. Have a good night.